All right, good morning, everyone. It is December 15th, and it is 11:03, and we're going to call the Electric Utility Board meeting to order.
Good morning, it's 11:03, and I will call the City Council meeting to order.
Do we have anyone signed up for public comment? Nope. And no emails. I guess we took that off now, so there we go. All right, that takes us to item executive session. We are now recessing into executive session in accordance with 1 VTCA Government Code 551.086 on competitive matters of LP&L, 2 VTCA Government Code 551.071 seeking advice of and consultation with LP&L's attorneys on a matter in which the duty of the attorney to the governmental body under the Texas Disciplinary Rules of Professional Conduct of the State Bar of Texas clearly conflicts with Chapter 551 of the Government Code and seeking advice of its attorneys about pending or contemplated litigation or settlement offers, and 3, VTCA Government Code 551.074 to the appointment, employment, evaluation, reassignment, and/or duties of a public officer or employee, being the Director of Electric Utilities, General Counsel, Chief Financial Officer, and Director of Customer Service, and deliberate the appointment of a public officer or employee to the EUB. We are now in exec.
The City Council will hold an executive session today for the purpose of consulting with the city staff regarding, first, the competitive matters of the public power utilities under Section 551.086 of the Texas Government Code. Secondly, pending or contemplated litigation or settlement offers, and hold consultation with the attorney under Section 551.071 of the Texas Government Code. And finally, personnel matters under Section 551.074 of the Texas Government Code. The Lubbock City Council is recessed into executive session.
All right, it is 12:37, and the EUB is reconvening into open session.
Sorry. It's 12:37. Council has returned from executive session, and additionally at 12:37, City Council meeting is adjourned.
Thank you all. All right, that brings us to item 7. We need to approve the minutes from the regular electric. Has joined us. Mr. Taylor, have you joined us on Zoom? You shoot him a text. You did see him on here?
I saw him earlier. I'm trying to make sure.
I just sent him a text asking him if he's on. See David. Brandon, can you tell? You're good? He says fixing to be on. He wants to wait?
You can go ahead and proceed. We just won't count until it's on the screen.
But we've got a quorum up there. Yes, it? All right, item 7, approve the minutes from the regular electric utility board meeting. Had a motion and a second. All those in favor do so by raising your hand, saying aye. Aye. Opposed by the same. Motion carries 8-0. Item 8, Mr. McCullough.
Okay, so just a few highlights from the report. Page 23. We've talked a lot about weatherization this month. I know that Matt has had a number of media interviews about what we've done to get ready for the winter, what we've done to our generating units, and so there's been quite a bit of work involved there. We also had PUC filing, which I think we mentioned. And so there was a lot of interest in weatherization as the winter approaches. We also had a lot of focus on scams. You know, it seems like every holiday season the scam artists get out there and start trying to take advantage of people. So we've spent a lot of effort and had some interviews talking about how to avoid scams, what to watch out for, and things like that. So that's really the only 2 highlights I wanted to call to the director's report.
Questions for Mr. McCullough? Thanks, sir.
And then I don't think we've got financial or Joe. We don't have reports from Joe and Renew on agenda item 8.
None? All right, item 8. Mr. Taylor, are you there? Okay. Item 9, clear.
We don't have any reports on agenda item 9.
Item 10,
You think Matt is going to start at
we can skip over you. We've done it in the past.
How do I? Okay, so we're going to cover this. Oh, there's Ms. Taylor.
Welcome.
Can y'all hear me okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Awesome, thank you.
So I will try to cover this as briefly as I can, and I'm going to say up front here that part of what I'm going to be talking about in the back half of these slides is pretty dense. So I'm going to talk through it pretty quickly, but then I'm going to tell you up front that I may defer to David for any sort of technical questions because it does get pretty technical. And as y'all are aware, we've been playing a part in this. We've submitted comments through these different rulemaking processes, including, kind of David's comments and his testimony down there in front of the PUC Commission. So I showed you these slides, first few slides last month as it relates to weatherization. We talked about the fact that per Senate Bill 3 and the directives of the governor's letter to the agencies, a series of rulemakings have been taking place really kind of at a record pace as it relates to the Public Utility Commission. We talked about the fact that, normally they might have 4 or 5, maybe 6 major rulemakings coming out of a session where they've got about a year to kind of get through these, where this go round they have about 30-something and have until the end of the year to get them done. So it's been moving at a rapid pace. But related to weatherization, these rules are going to apply to ERCOT generation entities and transmission service providers. And we talked about last month that the deadline for generation entities and for transmission service providers was December 1st to put in their filing to show that they've completed preparedness for cold weather critical components, that they've installed things like windbreaks and various different weatherization materials in order to avoid power plants shutting down. And per that December 1st deadline, at least on the generation side, it was reported that I think 5 of the 800 some odd that would submit their attestations and their filings, that there were only 5 that did not complete that. But the commission has been very aggressive, and they've said very publicly that we intend to follow the directives that are in the legislation in terms of the penalties that will be incurred by these facilities. It lays out that those penalties are up to $1 million per violation per day. So, one of the notable people that were named that didn't comply is Shell. And again, they're going to have financial penalties for not adhering to that. So I don't really have any information as to why that one large entity did not submit for some of its facilities. But the good news is the overwhelming vast majority did, including Lubbock Power and Light. We talked about a lot that we've done a bunch of things up front to weatherize our plant, so we didn't have to do that much. But we continually, every budget season, put in new equipment. And as David mentioned, we did some news articles. News stories showing what's been happening at, say, like Massengale with the windbreaks and the building facilities over the water units, those types of things. So just wanted to touch on that real quick. Now, to get into what is the more kind of dense and complicated portion of this, it's the market redesign that we've been talking about. And the PUC put out their proposal, their blueprint. And so I'm going to walk through this fairly quickly, but these are some of the areas that they talked about. Operating reserve demand curve, and so basically what they said for this is that they, sorry to use abbreviations, but the ORDC, to modify the ORDC to reward reliable generation assets that are able to be dispatched as the ERCOT reserve margin decreases. For this, they said that these changes immediately need to be made by January 1st, and it lowers the minimum contingency level to 3,000 megawatts and sets the system-wide offer cap at $5,000 per megawatt hour. That's a lot of what you heard of where it went to that system cap for an extended period of time. So There's an immediate change to that, and the next step is to work to kind of further delineate some of these areas and improve on that. Demand response, adopt changes to allow for a more targeted demand response to increase utilization of load resources for grid reliability. There's been a lot of talk about demand response from the commission. I know they're looking very heavily at this, and so they will continue to tweak that as next steps go forward. Emergency Response Service Reform, ERS. It's an operational tool that's deployed earlier so that large commercial and industrial customers, distributed generation facilities, aggregated customers can curtail their electric consumption. There's been a lot of talk about, again, trying to get ahead of events so that there can be some pre-measures that are taken that lessen the impact when you get to the moment of, the big storm and possibly people going offline. Fast Frequency Response Service. ERCOT's developing this to help stabilize the grid frequency in the future. Loads and non-spinning reserve service. This expands ERCOT's existing non-spinning reserve service to allow loads to participate in service to provide additional versatility for addressing forecast error and ramping issues. And then this is a whole bunch of ancillary service products, but like firm fuel product, voltage support compensation, again, looking at shoring up some of the issues in the ancillary services. ERCOT Contingency Reserve Service. I'm going to move forward here. Load side reliability mechanism. Again, a lot of these are getting into a lot of detail, and so I'll tell you what I'm going to do for the sake of time. Instead of reading this off to you, I'm going to pass this on to David and let him come up and really hit the high points, because all of this is pretty dense, and I want to make sure that y'all get the things
Mr.
that
Rose,
directly
Mr.
affect us.
Boatman has a question.
Has there been any progress through the Railroad Commission to increase the weatherization of the gas suppliers?
Yes, there has been. And so this past week, the Railroad Commission passed rules. And one of the things that they addressed, because one of the big issues is kind of that, what is critical and what is not critical. There's been a lot of talk of folks being able to say that they're not critical. So what they did do was they set out a new set of standards that says that certain facilities are not eligible for an exception. And these include gas wells or oil leases producing gas in excess of, what's that there? Yes, so large oil and gas leases, gas processing plants, natural gas pipelines or pipeline facilities that directly serve local distribution companies or electric generation, local distribution company pipelines or pipeline facilities, underground natural storage facilities, natural gas liquid storage or transportation facilities, and saltwater disposal facilities that support the other listed facilities. So basically, they've set out that these that are directly serving are not eligible for an exemption. The other thing they're doing is they form that gas supply mapping commission, and so their next step on this is to further delineate. They've got to create a whole mapping system so that they know all the different pipelines in the state and which ones fall underneath this, and then they will come back and say, we need to establish rules that these specific facilities are not eligible to say that they're not critical. So they've established, the different facilities that need to be critical, and then they're going to map them out to kind of further delineate which ones should be. And there's a lot of talk about the fact that the gas companies have had extra time per the legislation in order to get this done. But what you've started to see is that members of the Business Commerce Committee and others in the state legislature have started putting pressure on them, so they are moving more quickly. The other big thing is that Todd Staples has been out there, and some of the other leadership has been out there saying that they are in direct communication with all of their providers in terms of making sure they now register on that list so that they're not cut in a rotating outage. When we went through, especially in the Permian Basin, there were gas facilities that could have been eligible, but they never registered. And so they've been working with all their different memberships to demand that everybody sign those so that nobody gets cut when they shouldn't be cut.
I wonder, did they get rid of that $150 exemption for gas companies that they had, loophole?
No, they didn't. But what they're trying to do is say that if you're named as critical, you don't have the option of being exempt.
okay.
So they're keeping that low threshold of a penalty or
Yeah.
a whatever, but they're trying to segment out and say, but you guys don't even try it because you're critical and you need to weatherize and you need to be brought up to speed, for sure, so.
Thank you.
Ms. Stafford?
Just one question. Right, one question, when is this effective? You said they just made the rules about certain non-exempt and went through and whatever. Is that a dragged out or?
No, I think it's the next step, and then they're gonna have to map it out, and then they will basically base the final rule off of the map that's submitted
Okay.
from the supply chain.
But for this winter, these non-exempt, the gas wells and the storage and that,
On the natural gas side, there's gonna be a lag this winter in terms of.
so they're not gonna be ready this winter?
Not fully, no.
Okay.
But on the power plant side, on the transmission service provider side, everybody had to submit their filings by December 1st. And so that process has already taken place, and a lot of these facilities have already made those upgrades. And again, we fall into that camp that we were already pretty well established on a lot of these
So
things.
who were those 5 and where is Shell? Is that on the coast or?
I'm not sure.
You said there were
exactly.
5 of 800 that hadn't complied.
Yes, ma'am. But Shell was the one that was mentioned the most. It was the most high profile. I'm not sure of the others, and I don't necessarily know for Shell. I couldn't name you the facilities specifically, but they kind of took the headline as the ones that had not complied as of the December 1st deadline.
So they've got that $1 million a day?
Yes, and again, I'm not exactly sure what they're going to assess them specifically on the penalties, but it is, the commission has said, it is $1 million a day per violation. I have to imagine that with Shell, maybe there's some lesser amount that they pay, but that's what's stated in the legislation.
All right, anyone else? Mr. McCullough?
Yeah, so Mr. Rose talked about some of this market design proposals that are coming out of the Public Utility Commission. There's really the Phase 1 tasks were stuff that they could implement pretty quickly, and then there were the Phase 2 market design proposals that are longer term in nature and would require more time to implement. And so these are the ones that I have been more focused on. I think the others are kind of in the low-hanging fruit category where the stuff they could do pretty quick, but these longer-term proposals have the potential to make significant changes to our market, and that's the ones that we're most concerned about. We did file comments they produced what they called a blueprint for how these market design proposals would go forward. We filed comments. The one that we're most opposed to is the loads serving entity obligation. I talked about this at the last meeting. The load serving entity obligation would require every load serving entity like Lubbock to acquire physical capacity on a seasonal annual basis to cover your load. And so that's, in some of our early comments said that's the reason we left SPP, because of that LSE obligation approach. So it's very similar to what they had there. They're creating a capacity obligation on the part of load entities and a capacity, bilateral capacity market, which would require everybody to sign up for capacity every year, which, our main concerns with that in our most recent filings, which are included in the packet, were that, it's very high cost to implement that kind of program, significant administrative implementation requirements, and the fact that we just haven't seen that it really works. In SPP, they've got a load-serving entity obligation, but their reserve margins are declining over the next 5 years, have declined over the previous 5 years, and even though they had this load-serving entity obligation in place, in February, we experienced rotating outages because they experienced the same generating plant forced outages, gas limitations, and everything, the same things that we saw in the ERCOT grid. So we just don't think it works. We don't think it's necessary. We think the other changes that they're talking about are better approaches. And that is the ones that we advocated for included the backstop reliability service. This was proposed by Commissioner Kobos, and it's a way to have have ERCOT basically acquire generating reserves that would sit there on the sidelines that wouldn't run until you get into a system emergency, and then ERCOT could dispatch those units online to run. And so they'd be paying generators a price to be sitting there in reserve. They're doing that on a short-term basis now with ancillary services, and this last summer they acquired about 3,000 megawatts of non-spend reserve and to be sitting there, and particularly in cases where your wind forecast may not be all that, you're not that confident that the wind is going to show up when it's supposed to, or you may have some cloudy weather coming through and the solar is not going to be there. So all of these things put risk into your load forecast, and so they've been acquiring additional reserves to accommodate for that. And so her thought was, let's just formalize that and put it on a seasonal and annual basis where ERCOT could buy reserves and have them sitting there for any type of emergency. We like that approach. We think it's easier to implement, more cost-effective than the LSE obligation approach. And then the one that was proposed by Commissioner McAdams was, and I don't know if it's in here or not, Matt. Yeah, I guess. Dispatchable energy credits. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, there's the LSE obligation. It's probably buried in here. I just don't see it. Yeah, this is it right here. So it would be fashioned similar to the Renewable Energy Credit Program, where everybody in the state had to acquire a certain amount of renewable energy credits. So it was a way to kickstart the renewable energy program. And over time, the value of those renewable energy credits has gone down as we've got more wind than what we know what to do with now in the grid. But so that program's still on the books, but the value of those retail or renewable energy credits has fallen over time. And that was McAdams' concept: is you have everybody acquire some capacity credits with a magnitude to be determined, and there would be some kind of a trading system set up where you could buy these credits from generators that had physical generating capacity, and then the value would start out at one level, and over time, as more capacity got added to the system, then the value of those capacity credits would, in theory, normalize and reduce over time. So we thought that program had some merit. It still needs a lot of work to flesh out, but we thought that was a better approach than the load-serving entity obligation approach, which has been tried and hasn't really done what they thought it was going to do. So in addition to the comments that we filed, there were TPPA filed comments. They were basically cautious about all of the filings going forward, and they all needed more detail, more study. Evaluate the cost versus the benefits of each one of them, which will take time. And so, and we support those comments as well. We think all of the studies need more work and more study to determine what's the most cost-effective approach. There were several comments filed that are similar to ours in nature. Golden Spread filed comments stating basically similar to what we did, that the load-serving entity obligation hadn't really worked in SPP. They're sitting in SPP like we are and were for all of our load at one time. Texas Association of Manufacturers, a really powerful lobby in the state, filed comments opposed to the LSE obligation of capacity. It's really creating a capacity market, which ERCOT has prided itself on having an energy-only market. So TIEC filed comments that were similar to ours as well. And so there's some big players in the state, strong lobbyists for the different manufacturers and commercial entities throughout the state that are opposed to this. So there is a Public Utility Commission meeting tomorrow, I believe. Is that right, Jenny? And they're going to be discussing this, possibly acting on the blueprint. So we'll be following that very closely and watching to see what comes out of that.
Questions? Ms. Stafford?
Do you anticipate they'll make a decision tomorrow?
I don't know because everybody had to file comments December 10th, which was last Friday. Is that right? So everybody filed, there's a whole long list of folks that filed comments, and some of them were limited to 5 pages, but there's still a lot of information there. So whether they can absorb all of that and be ready to make a decision tomorrow is kind of up in the air. It's posted where they can take action, but whether they will or not, I guess we'll have to see.
In addition, I read your response, and it was excellent, and thank you for doing that and taking the lead on it, of opposing the LSEs.
Yeah, I have to give Jenny a lot of credit for the wording in there. We on these filings, we've become a pretty good team in putting these filings together and tweaking them and running them by other folks as well. So it's a team effort.
Thanks, sir. Any other questions or comments on item 10? All right, item 11. Mr. McCullough.
Yeah, let me catch up with slides here.
Mr. Taylor, you on still?
Retail choice presentation.
You left? Okay.
Okay, so we wanted to, there were a number of questions that the board raised at the last meeting. I want to touch on those, but I wanted to start with the Polar provider of last resort discussion. That was a suggestion that Mr. Taylor had made. I was hoping he would be on the call to hear some of this, but the question was asked if LP&L should consider becoming the provider of last resort, and I think there's some benefits to doing that, but there's also some impacts and some costs. So the costs are that it's estimated that Polar option would cost an additional $12 million to implement compared to the original opt-in option, so there's the cost associated with that. Additional 6 months of lead time to define the systems that would be necessary to support that. And the other impacts are we wouldn't be able to entirely remove ourselves from the power supply portion of the business, which was one of our goals in joining the retail market. And this retail market system design is significantly more complex than the non-Polar option. So those are some high-level considerations. And then here is the breakdown on the cost. You can see the software product itself is a little bit of money. The software services is where the big costs come in. Getting the system designed that we need probably almost doubles the cost of software services. Support services from our third party would go up by about $5 million. So there's some significantly higher cost in just defining the system, and that's where most of that cost comes in. Here's a kind of an overview of the system with Polar in there, and you can see interfaces are necessary with all of the standard systems that we interface with now. But the part in the middle is what would be new and different. So you would have interfaces with all the customer service functions, the bill print, customer self-service, and IVR and other pay options. Have to have interfaces with the Oracle Field Service. You have to have interfaces with the payment and processing group, because we would be, the big change here is that we would be sending bills to the customers that were taking service from the Polar, which we're not doing in the other options. So you really have to take all of the customer information out of this current system, drop it over into the other system, and the ones that are default to the Polar, we would have to be able to bill and perform collection services and all that, just like we do now, except that it would be in the new system. They have to be in the new system because at some point they'll want to change off the Polar onto a regular retail electric provider. So you can't continue to bill them the way we are now. They've got to be extracted from that and put into the new system, so they could still have choice to move to a different retail electric provider. Now, I've got Jamie here today. If you have any technical questions about this slide, she can answer them. If you might expose my ignorance pretty quick if you start asking detailed technical questions.
Questions? My question would be, so say we're not the Polar, then all that information's got to go somewhere as well anyways, correct?
Yeah, it will be in the TDSP bracket there, the one on the left-hand side. So all of that information will be in there.
Somewhere the information is going regardless,
Right.
though. Okay.
But you can see that in that block, you don't have all the links with the billing and payment processing, collections, and all of that. So it's a simpler configuration.
Mr. Bowman?
David, under these circumstances, will LPNL still continue the billing system for the city, or will they be?
Yeah.
What-
That's a question that was asked at the last meeting. I've talked to Jared about that. It's an open question and one that needs some discussion and dialogue. I think that we don't have the answer to that question yet.
Well, now, if we went polar, though, that would change that situation, wouldn't it? We'd still have to,
Potentially.
we'd have to bill
Yep.
the remaining electric customers plus
Right.
the city's customers.
Yep. Could potentially change it. So when we have, when all the city of Lubbock utilities is doing is serving the other four utilities, not electric, then I think it would be an opportunity to restructure that group under the city administration if we wanted to do that. But I think we don't know enough to intelligently make that decision yet.
Mr. Taylor?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I lost the feed back a little bit ago right before y'all got into this discussion. So I think I heard Mr. McCullough talk about the additional cost, roughly 12 million additional cost. And then I've heard the question there. I think the duplication of data is not something that I had anticipated in our last meeting. In other words, basically having to take that data from the initial system and in effect take a copy of that data that fits with those who have chosen to use us as a polar into a separate system in order to maintain that billing. Now, and I believe practically speaking, then we would still wind up sending a separate electric bill. I suppose we wouldn't have to, but we'd still wind up sending an electric bill, of course, to those folks who chose us for their reading. So it is a significant amount more complication than what I had envisioned at our last meeting, and I think that cost is significant and should be definitely given due consideration before we just assume that we're going to take on that role. So,
Well, question for the board then.
I apologize. I feel a little bit like Big Brother here.
You look like it too, Mr. Taylor.
You are Big Brother. It's kind of hard to have a 12-foot picture if you look over my right shoulder.
Or the Wizard of Oz, one or the other.
So I need a little guidance from the board. We have prepared the contracts with the folks that will provide the software and this implementation services, oversight services, and all that. We've got those contracts basically prepared and ready to go under the original concept where we would not be the polar, and we would be in a position to bring those to the board for action in January. If you don't want us to do that, if you want us to perform further study on polar, then it's going to delay the start date for getting the systems going. So I just need some direction on how y'all want us to proceed there.
There's a question asked, I can't remember who asked it, but it kind of goes off of what Mr. Taylor was stating. But the folks that, I guess, default into the polar, are they going to be notified? This is a little different question than the billing and everything else, but are they going to be notified after the fact, before the fact? I guess less sophisticated people that don't have the internet maybe, or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's. I think we will have knowledge of who has not selected a retail electric provider, and so the ones that would default to a polar, we can certainly investigate whether or not we can communicate with them directly, either by email or telephone call. I think we need to do a little more research on that, but I think we certainly hope to have. Mr. Rose has already been working on an education plan. We hope to educate every single customer in Lubbock about what they need to do and how they can do it, and kind of give them some guidance on how to select their retail electric provider so that nobody will be ignorant of what they need to do. But it's always hard to reach every single person, and so, but it will take a methodical approach to try to reach out to everybody. So whether we do mailers to everybody in the city, which I think we could do. There's a cost associated with that, but I think we could do that. We could do town hall meetings. We could do newspaper ads, radio, TV ads, there's a lot of ways that we can reach out to folks in Lubbock up front, even before the drop dead date for selecting a retail electric provider. But in the event we have not been able to reach a segment of the population, I don't know for sure what our limits are on being able to directly reach out to those individuals, but we'll research that.
Okay. And then back to your question, you're wanting guidance on whether or not to send out the RFIs, is that what it is? RFPs?
We will be bringing contracts for board approval, and that's where we're at.
Okay.
And we would like to do that in January if possible so we can get started. I mean, if we're going to hit that October 2023 deadline that we talked about, then we need to get started. You're potentially risking go live date if we push it out much beyond that. And we're comfortable going either, however y'all want us to go. I'm just telling you that we need some direction on how you want us to proceed.
Mr. Fields, you were in billing once.
Yes, I've got several questions. There's quite a bit here I'm not sure I understand. Is it possible for us to get a more robust session involving, let's say, LPNL being the pollar? I mean, I hear this $12 million figure, but I have not seen, I don't really understand the breakdown of it. And based upon prior understanding of CIS systems, I'm not sure why we would need a separate system. Now, I realize the system has changed from prior years ago, but I'm not getting all the pieces together to really understand why we need what we need.
We can proceed in a couple of different directions. We can call a technical committee meeting for those that are interested in a more deeper dive on the analysis here, or I've got the technical folks here that may be able to respond to your questions today. So how do you want to proceed?
I would rather us have a separate.
I think a separate meeting with the technical committee, I mean, that's kind of what I believe that was tasked for back 3 or 4 years ago when those committees were created. I think that's good, and I mean, I think send it out to the entire board.
Sure.
So we'll have to post for it, but that way we can do a deeper dive into it and truly understand that. Can you go back one slide where the 12 million was showing? I was trying to see where the numbers changed there, but then unknown. Okay. Are y'all, Mr. Taylor, would that help you as well?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Okay.
I believe Mr. Fields is on the right track. I agree with his assessment. I've had some discussions with Mr. McCullough regarding those, but I think it would be good for a larger number of the board members and to be involved in that discussion and be able to see the roots of those. I think where we are, Mr. Chairman, quite frankly, is we need to continue to move in the direction that we had intended to move, but I think we need to be able to take these discussions or side courses or whatever you want to call them to keep the board educated about what we're doing, and we need a lot more information to understand the impact this is going to have on our customers, and what the stance of LPNL needs to be as an operating entity, and what's going to be required for it to take that stance as we move forward. And if we were to choose some other stance vis-a-vis our customers and ratepayers, what all of those costs would be and what that would entail. So I think we need to continue to make progress toward whatever systems are necessary for the opt-in decision or the opt-in switchover, but at the same time, we need to be fully educated about the parameters of not doing that or of postponing that past the October 1st, 2023 target date, because I think there are other issues that might actually encourage us to postpone that beyond that point in time. So I'll That's all I have for right now.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fields, that work for you?
Yes, as long as we have a separate, more robust meeting, I'm happy with it.
We
Yeah, good
will, we will set a technical committee meeting, invite the entire board, and it would be more of a workshop setting, not a formal board meeting, but a workshop setting where we can
I think that's a
have
good path.
presentations and have some dialogue.
One question, in terms of trying to certainly keep things moving forward, would that technical committee be sometime this month?
What we will do is check calendars and see who would be available when. I think there's one other meeting that we would like to schedule by the end of the month. We could marry that together with the other meeting as well.
That would work. Is everyone good with that? I think that's a good pathway, and hopefully get some more answers dialed down.
Okay, there was a couple of other questions raised that I wanted to touch on. So we talked about Polar, we talked about the City of Lubbock utilities and what might happen to it. There was a question about our wires charges, and I think, and how we would develop our TDU rate. That's pretty important, but it's going to require some time. We've got a consultant, NewGen, that's developing an updated cost of service model that would be kind of the base case for developing those TDU charges. And Joe, have they started on that, or have we? No, they haven't started. So they haven't kicked off yet, but that's one that would start pretty quick, early next year, I would think, and get going on that. So it may take a while to develop those wires charges, but Mr. McMahon asked about where do the extra charges fall: demand, disconnect, reconnect fees, typical everyday fees, and I think that would be built into our tariff and would be billed to the individual retail electric providers.
Mr. McCullough, I think Ms. Stafford has a question.
One other question, you have several places that are unknowns, so the 12 million additional cost is going to be in addition to what those unknowns are. Is that correct?
Right.
Right here. Good.
Okay, if the LPNL is the Polar, would we have to get our rates approved by the PUC? And the answer to that is no. The governing bodies would have authority over that rate and terms and conditions. Transfers to the city, I think we talked about that. We'd develop a cents per kilowatt hour fee that would replace the revenue percentage fee that would continue the transfers in the magnitude of, generally the magnitude that they are today or have been the last 5 years. I think that's it. Are there any other questions? Now, one of the things we heard from yesterday's meeting with City Council is that they felt like communications, if the governing bodies decide to go this way, the communications was key. I know Mr. Rose has spent some time working on that. He did an excellent job in May when we had the ERCOT cutover and communicating, and everybody thought that was a good communications plan. I think we need something even more involved and more over a year and a half period of time to communicate effectively on this matter. And so he's working on a plan for that he can present at a future board meeting. And I think that's it.
The only comment I would make, and Eddie can probably back me up on this on the banking side, but it would seem to me too that if we end up the Polar, there's going to be, and do the opt-in, all that type of stuff, or whatever else, there's going to be those folks out there that come and eventually take all the good customers, and you're left with the folks that you're dealing with on a daily basis that are more, I guess, delinquent, and maybe $80 that you're tracking down, chasing down these type of things, and that's what you're spending a lot of your time doing. And it's not just managing what this fee or rate's going to be. It's you're dealing with past dues every day, and that's where y'all's focus would be, is basically collections. And so the staff, with all this diagram and everything else, that's where you would end up. Whether that takes a year or 10 years to get to that point, but eventually it is the provider of last resort. So that's where you have. I think everyone needs to be cognizant of that as well. Of we become a collections company at some point.
You're going to be dealing with the customers that are higher maintenance customers.
Right, higher maintenance as a go. So, Sorry you had to fall on that sword there, Eddie, with me, but yeah. Any other discussion on that? Thank you. Mr. Taylor, are you good?
Yes, sir. I was able to follow most of that discussion and the questions. I think, like I say, I just reiterate my earlier point that there are a lot of buckets in this decision, and you raised a very good one. There's also the continuing risk if we're supplying a certain amount of power, retailing a certain amount of power to our customers, but not all of it. Obviously, that's a risk. How much do we have to buy? How much are we going to pay for that, et cetera? So there are a lot of complicating factors there. So I think, I just think we need to take the time that's necessary to walk through these while not stopping our processes, whatever we need to do to accomplish moving toward opt-in. And again, I would reiterate my earlier statement that all of this together may mean that we need to continue to be the sole provider for our certificated area for a longer period than simply October 1st, 2023.
Correct.
So in my mind, that's not, while we're moving toward that date, that's not necessarily the final word on the subject.
All right, thanks, sir. Is that all for item 11?
I think so.
Okay. At this moment, we're not prepared to discuss item 12, so that will take us to item 13, consider, nominate, and elect officers of the EUB, and consider possible minute action to appoint members of the officer positions for 2022. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, given the many transitions that we're going through, I would make a motion that we retain the current leadership of officers. Mr. Odom as chairman, Mr. McMahon as vice chairman, and Ms. Stafford as secretary. And I put that in the form of a motion.
Thank you, Ms. Stafford.
Second.
Mr. McMahon, seconded. Any discussion? If not, we'll take that to vote. All those in favor, raise your right hand, say aye. Aye. Opposed by the same? Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Motion carries 9-0. That takes us to the consent agenda, items 14 through 23. If there's any questions or no comments there, I'll entertain a motion for items 14 through 23. Got a motion by Mr. Boatman.
Second.
Have a second by Butch. All those in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed by the same? Carries 9-0 as well. Takes us to item 24. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you all.